Picture this. Colorado Territory, 1873. A brutal winter storm traps a young mother alone in a remote cabin with newborn twins. Her husband is missing. The fire is dying. Food is running out. Death seems inevitable until a mysterious stranger appears at her door. But accepting his help will force her to choose between survival and everything society expects from a proper woman. Will she risk her reputation to save her children's lives? If you're loving this story, smash that like button, hit subscribe for more incredible historical tales, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's dive into this unforgettable journey. The wind pressed against the cabin walls like desperate hands, seeking entry through every crack and crevice that winter had opened in the aging wood. Sarah Mitchell sat in the rocking chair her grandmother had carved, holding Emily against her chest, while James slept fitfully in the makeshift crib Thomas had fashioned from apple crates before he left. 2 days. 2 days since he'd ridden toward town for supplies, and the doctor promising to return before the storm worsened. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to embers that cast dancing shadows across the room. Shadows that seemed to mock her with their restless movement, while she remained frozen in place, afraid to disturb the fragile quiet that kept her babies sleeping. Her milk had grown thin from worry and sparse eating, and Emily's cries had become weaker, more resigned, a sound that carved hollow spaces in Sarah's chest. Outside, the Colorado Territory stretched endless and white, swallowing tracks and landmarks beneath its cruel blanket. The wind carried no sound of approaching hooves, no jingle of harness that might herald Thomas's return, only the whispered promises of a storm that showed no mercy to those who dared to dream of taming this land. She closed her eyes and let her fingers trace the worn edges of her mother's cameo brooch, pinned to her dress like a talisman against the encroaching darkness. The oval piece of carved shell had traveled from Pennsylvania in her small trunk. Of precious things, carrying with it the scent of her mother's lavender powder and the memory of gentle hands braiding her hair. Now it felt cold against her fingertips, as cold as the realization settling in her bones that she might be truly alone. The cabin creaked and settled around her, timbers protesting the weight of snow that accumulated on the roof with each passing hour. Thomas had built well, but even good craftsmanship had its limits against a winter like this. She could feel the cold seeping through the walls, gathering in corners where their warmth couldn't reach. Patient and relentless in its advance, Emily stirred against her breast, making small sounds of distress that pulled Sarah from her reverie. She rose carefully, moving to the window where ice had formed intricate patterns on the glass. Nature's own artwork, beautiful and suffocating. Through the narrow, clear space at the center, she could see nothing but white that erased the boundaries between earth and sky, between hope and despair. Her reflection stared back at her from the frosted, glass-pale face framed by dark hair that had escaped its pins, eyes that had grown too large in the weeks since the twins' birth. She looked like a ghost of herself, haunting a life that had once held such promise. Thomas's dreams of cattle and prosperity seemed as distant now as the Pennsylvania hills they'd left behind. The wind gusted again, rattling the shutters, and Sarah pressed her palm against the cold glass. Somewhere beyond the storm, past the white void that had swallowed her world, people went about their lives in warm houses, with full pantries and certain tomorrows. But here, in this small wooden island surrounded by winter's ocean, time had slowed to the rhythm of her children's breathing and the steady burning of their dwindling supply of wood. She turned back to the room, to the reality of jars grown, nearly empty, and the last precious pieces of coal glowing in the grate. Tomorrow she would have to make choices. Tomorrow the pretense that Thomas might still return would crack like ice under spring sun. But tonight she would hold her babies close and listen to the wind's lonely song, gathering what strength she could from the silence between its howling voices. The third morning brought a stillness that felt more ominous than the storm's fury. Sarah stood at the window, watching crystalline flakes drift down like lost thoughts, each one adding to the white burden that pressed against their small sanctuary. The silence outside was so complete, it seemed to ring in her ears, broken only by the whispered crackle of her carefully rationed fire. She had fed the twins the last of her stored milk that morning, warming it carefully over the coals while they fussed with hunger she could barely satisfy. The sight of their small faces flushed with need carved something sharp and desperate in her chest. James's cry had grown hoarse, Emily's movements weak and fluttering like a bird with a broken wing. The woodpile had shrunk to a pitiful heap of kindling and 2 split logs. She could stretch it perhaps through the day if she was careful, if she let the cold creep closer to their small circle of warmth, but tomorrow would demand a choice between heat and hope, between preserving their lives for another day and maintaining the signal that might bring rescue. She moved through the cabin like a sleepwalker, performing the rituals of survival with mechanical precision, checking the corners where cold gathered like unwelcome guests, adjusting the blankets around the twins with hands that trembled not from temperature, but from the weight of responsibility that pressed heavier than snow upon her shoulders. From her grandmother's trunk, she withdrew the quilt that had covered her marriage bed back in Pennsylvania. Blue and white stars pieced together by patient hands during long winter evenings. The fabric held memories of easier times, of Thomas's gentle touch and whispered plans for their future. She wrapped it around herself like armor against despair. The cameo brooch caught the firelight as she moved, its carved surface gleaming with the warm light of better days. She touched it again, drawing comfort from its solid presence. Her mother had worn it to church every Sunday, had fastened it to Sarah's dress on her wedding day, with fingers that shook slightly with joy and sorrow at letting her youngest daughter go. Outside, something shifted in the endless white. Sarah's eyes caught the movement, not wind-driven snow, but something more purposeful, more alive. She pressed her face to the glass, breath fogging the small, clear space she'd maintained by scraping away the frost each morning. There at the edge of vision, a darker shape moved against the pale canvas of the world. Her heart began a rapid rhythm that seemed to echo in the stillness of the cabin. Could it be Thomas finally returned, or perhaps one of the neighbors checking on isolated homesteads after the storm? She strained to see more clearly, but the figure remained indistinct, moving with a deliberate pace that spoke of someone who knew how to travel in deep snow. The shape paused, and Sarah felt rather than saw attention turn toward their cabin. The thin column of smoke rising from their chimney would be visible for miles in this clear air, a signal of life in the vast emptiness, or perhaps a beacon of distress to anyone wise enough to read winter's harsh language. She stepped back from the window, suddenly aware of how exposed she was, silhouetted against the lamplight. What if it wasn't Thomas? What if the approaching figure brought danger instead of deliverance? Her mind catalogued the few weapons Thomas had left, his hunting knife in the kitchen drawer, the old rifle above the mantelpiece that she'd never learned to load properly. But even as fear prickled along her spine, another part of her sang with desperate hope. Anyone who could travel in these conditions possessed skills she desperately needed. Anyone who would venture out in such weather might be willing to help a woman alone with 2 infants, might know ways to survive that she hadn't considered. The wind picked up again, swirling the falling snow in small cyclones that obscured her view. When it settled, the figure was closer, close enough for her to see it was a person moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged in this harsh landscape. Close enough to see they carried provisions, to notice the purposeful way they approached the cabin. Sarah gathered the twins closer, Emily in her arms and James bundled in his crate cradle that she pulled near to the fire. Whatever came next, she would face it with what remained of her strength, with the fierce protectiveness that motherhood had awakened in her heart, like a banked fire suddenly given air. The knock came soft but deliberate. 3 measured raps. That seemed to understand the fragility of the moment. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen between the window and the door. Emily pressed against her shoulder, while James stirred in his makeshift bed. The sound echoed in the small space like a question posed by fate itself. She forced her feet to move, each step across the plank floor a small act of courage. The rifle hung above the mantel, but her arms were full of child and hope, and she found herself choosing trust over caution. Her hand hesitated on the wooden latch, then lifted it with the soft click of a decision made. The man on her threshold was not Thomas. He stood tall against the white backdrop of the world, dark hair braided with leather cord, wearing a coat that mixed the practical wool of settlers with the fur-lined wisdom of those who knew winter's true face. His eyes, the color of storm. Clouds took in her situation with a glance that missed nothing. The pale exhaustion in her face, the small bundle in her arms, the thin curl of smoke that spoke of a fire dying by degrees. "Mom." His voice carried the careful cadence of someone who spoke English as a chosen language rather than a birthright. "Saw your smoke, been watching it thin for 2 days now." Sarah found her voice trapped somewhere between her racing heart and her desperate need. "My husband, he went for supplies. The storm. Storm's been hard. He didn't move closer. Didn't push past her defenses. Just stood patient as a tree waiting for spring. You got little ones." It wasn't a question, and something in his tone, gentle matter of fact, loosened the tight control she'd maintained over her composure. "Twins. They're hungry, and either wood's nearly gone." He nodded as if her words confirmed something. He'd already understood. From the pack on his shoulders, he drew out split logs wrapped in oiled cloth, dry and ready for burning. Been hunting nearby, got extra. The simple generosity of the gesture, offered without demand or explanation, nearly undid her. She stepped back from the door, not quite invitation, but no longer refusal. He entered with the careful movements, of someone accustomed to being watched with suspicion, placing the wood beside her failing fire, before turning back to face her properly. "Name's Cota Reynolds. Folks sometimes call me Eagle Eye." He spoke as if offering credentials, as if understanding that a woman alone had the right to know who stood in her sanctuary. "You can call me Cota Sarah Mitchell." Her own name felt strange, on her tongue, as if she'd been someone else entirely during the long isolation of the storm. "This is Emily and James's." She gestured toward the crate where her son slept. Cota's attention moved to the baby with the focused intensity that had likely earned him his hunting name. "How long since they've eaten proper?" The question cut through her pride like winter wind through worn wool. "Yesterday morning my milk, I haven't been eating enough and I got jerky. Good for mothers." He moved toward his pack again, and Sarah noticed the economy of his movements, the way he seemed to take up no more space than necessary in her small domain. "Got other things, too. Herbs my mother uses for new mothers, little ones." The mention of his mother brought a flush of questions, but Emily chose that moment to fuss against her shoulder, small sounds of distress that spoke louder than words. Cota paused, his hand stilling on his pack as he listened to the baby's complaint. "She's hungry," Sarah said unnecessarily, embarrassment coloring her voice. "Babies know what they need." His response carried no judgment, only the practical wisdom of someone who'd observed life in its various forms. "You eat something now. Feed her better tonight." He resumed his quiet unpacking, producing not just jerky but dried berries wrapped in soft leather, packets of what looked like ground grain. and small bundles of herbs that filled the cabin with scents of earth and healing. Each item appeared with the careful presentation of gifts offered rather than charity dispensed. Sarah watched him work, noting the way he checked the fit of the logs in her fireplace, the practiced manner in which he arranged kindling to coax the flame higher. His presence changed the quality of the air itself, bringing warmth that had nothing to do with the improved fire, and everything to do with no longer being alone against winter's indifference. "For your husband," Coda said without looking up from his work. He went toward town. Yes, 2 days ago, before the worst of it hit, she heard the hope in her own voice, fragile as spun glass. Coda nodded slowly, feeding another piece of wood to the fire. "Roads are bad. Might be holed up somewhere safe, waiting for clear weather. He didn't promise Thomas would return, didn't offer false comfort, but he gave her permission to hope without feeling foolish." The fire caught properly now, casting steady light and warmth through the cabin, transforming it from a place of desperate waiting into something that resembled a home again. By evening, the cabin had transformed into something Sarah barely recognized. Where desperation had lived, practical purpose now took residence. Coda moved through the space with an efficiency that spoke of winters survived and crises weathered, never presuming ownership, but somehow managing to tend fires and organize supplies as if he'd been born to the task. He'd prepared a stew from his provisions, meat and dried vegetables simmered with herbs that released sense of comfort into the warming air. Sarah ate slowly, each spoonful, a revelation of flavors she'd almost forgotten existed. Her body responded, with gratitude, and with it came the gradual return of milk that allowed Emily to nurse properly for the first time in days. "Your mother," Sarah found herself saying as she watched Coda tend to small tasks, checking the window seals, arranging wood for efficient burning. "You mentioned her knowledge of herbs." His hands paused in their work, and she saw something soften in the set of his shoulders. Willow's song, she's Comanche, knows the old ways of helping mothers' children. He glanced toward where Emily dozed in Sarah's arms. "These herbs, they're for strength. Help your body remember what it knows." The words carried layers of meaning that Sarah felt rather than understood. She watched him work with materials that seemed foreign, yet familiar. Leather cords and carved implements, small pouches that released earthy scents when opened. There was reverence in how he handled each item, as if they carried the weight. "Serve generations." "And your father?" The question emerged before she could consider its propriety. "Trader named Reynolds met my mother during a peace talk near the Arkansas River." Codd's voice held the measured tone of someone who'd explained this lineage many times. "Taught me his language, his ways. Mother taught me hers. Sometimes useful being between worlds." Sarah understood more than she expected to about existing between worlds. Pennsylvania and Colorado, wife and widow, mother and child herself, navigating territory with no reliable maps. It must be difficult sometimes. He looked up from the leather cord he was repairing, and for a moment their eyes met with the recognition of shared experience. Sometimes other times see things others miss, like smoke getting thin when it should run strong. The observation brought warmth that had nothing to do with the improved fire. He'd been watching over them without their knowledge, noting signs of distress and responding with help rather than judgment. The thought stirred something in her chest, gratitude mixed with an unfamiliar sensation of being truly seen. James woke then, adding his voice to the evening's gentle sounds. Sarah shifted Emily to accommodate her son, but the logistics of managing both infants while eating proved challenging. Without being asked, Coda moved closer, extending his hands toward James with a question in his gesture. Sarah hesitated only a moment before transferring her son to this stranger's arms. Coda held James with the sure grip of someone comfortable. With small life, supporting the baby's head with practiced ease, while making soft sounds that seemed to cross the boundaries of language itself. "You have children?" Sarah asked, though something in his manner suggested the answer wasn't simple. "Not of my own, but Comanche children belong to everyone. Learn to help from small age." His voice carried warmth as he watched James settle against his chest. "Babies don't care about skin color, what language you speak. They know who's safe." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Sarah wasn't ready to examine. Instead, she focused on the immediate miracle of eating a warm meal while both her children rested peacefully. The simple luxury of having help, of not bearing every responsibility alone, made her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. Outside, night had settled over the white world, but inside the cabin, lamplight and firelight created a sphere of warmth that felt separate from the harsh territory beyond their walls. Coda began to hum softly, a melody that seemed to blend. Traditions neither wholly familiar nor entirely foreign, the sound wrapped around them like another layer of warmth. "The storm," Sarah said eventually. "How much longer do you think it will last?" Coda considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Winds changing should clear by tomorrow, day after. But snow's deep, roads will be hard for a while." The implications settled between them like stones dropped in still water. Thomas might not return for days, weeks even, and when he did, Sarah pushed the thought away, unwilling to examine what his prolonged absence might mean for their marriage, their plans, their carefully constructed dreams of prosperity. "My people," Coda said quietly. "We winter near Willow Creek, not far from here, safe place, warm lodges, plenty of food." He paused, his attention on James, but his words clearly for her. "Always room for mothers with children, no questions asked, no debt owed." The offer hung in the warming air like a bridge extended across an impossible chasm. Sarah felt its weight, its generosity, and beneath that, the terrifying possibility that she might need to cross. Sarah woke to the sound of splitting wood, rhythmic, purposeful strokes that spoke of strength applied with precision. Grey dawn. Light filtered through the frost-edged windows, revealing a world still locked in white, but somehow less threatening than it had seemed in the storm's fury. She lay still for a moment, listening to the unfamiliar comfort of someone else shouldering the burden of survival. Coda had spent the night by the fire, wrapped in blankets from his pack, maintaining the warmth that kept her children safe. She'd offered him the bed, but he declined with quiet courtesy, explaining that he was accustomed to sleeping rough, and she needed proper rest to care for the twins. His presence had transformed her sleep from the fitful dozing of the desperate into something deeper, more restorative. Emily stirred, against her side, making small sounds of waking hunger. Sarah gathered her close, marveling at how much stronger the baby felt after a night of proper feeding. Beside them, James slept with the boneless peace of an infant whose needs had been met without struggle or worry. The door opened as she sat up, and Coda entered, carrying an armload of fresh split wood, his breath steaming in the cold air. Snow clung to his dark hair and the shoulders of his coat, but his movement spoke of someone energized rather than depleted by the morning's work. "Snow stopping," he said by way of greeting, stacking the wood beside the fireplace with practiced efficiency. "Should be clear by noon." Sarah felt her heart do something complicated at the news. Clear weather meant the possibility of Thomas's return of rescue and reunion, but it also meant Coda might leave, returning to whatever life he'd been living before he'd chosen to help a stranger in need. "You'll be wanting to get back to your people," she said, testing the words and finding them inadequate for what she actually felt. He paused in his work, glancing toward the window where morning light revealed the storm's retreat. "Depends," Your husband might need time to get through. The snow. Roads won't be good for traveling. The practical observation carried layers of meaning. He was offering to stay to continue shouldering responsibilities that weren't his to bear. The generosity of it, the uncomplicated willingness to help, stirred emotions in Sarah that she wasn't prepared to examine too closely. "I don't want to keep you from your family," she said, though the words felt like offering away her last lifeline. "My family knows winter. No, I help where help's needed," he resumed, stacking wood, but his tone carried certainty rather than obligation. "Besides, babies shouldn't be alone in weather like this. Not safe." Emily chose that moment to fuss more, insistently, and Sarah moved to tend to her, grateful for the excuse to look away from Cod's steady gaze. As she nursed her daughter, she found herself studying this man who'd appeared like an answer to prayers she'd been afraid to voice. He moved through morning tasks with the same quiet competence he'd shown the night before, checking the fire, preparing food from his seemingly endless supply of provisions, attending to details that spoke of someone who understood how quickly comfort could turn to crisis in this harsh land. "Your mother's herbs," Sarah said as strength flowed back into her body, along with the milk that fed her child. "They're helping." "Good. She knows what mothers need." He glanced up from the pot he was stirring, and Sarah caught something like pride in his expression. "Been helping women birth babies, heal from birthing for more years than I've been alive. I'd like to thank her someday." The words emerged without conscious thought, carrying implications that surprised her even as she spoke them. Something shifted in Cod's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a careful attention to her tone that suggested he'd heard more than gratitude in her words. "Maybe you will. Winter camp's not far. Good place for healing, learning new ways." The mention of learning new ways sent a flutter of something through Sarah's chest. Not fear exactly, but awareness of possibilities she'd never considered. Her life had been mapped out in familiar patterns. Pennsylvania childhood, marriage to Thomas, westward migration toward prosperity and respectability. But here in this cabin, warming food provided by a man who belonged to a world she'd barely acknowledged, those patterns seemed suddenly arbitrary. "What are they like, your people?" The question emerged from curiosity, mixed with something deeper, a recognition that her old certainties might no longer serve her needs. Kota considered her words with the same care he gave everything else. Different from what you probably heard. More like families than the stories traders tell. Share food, share warmth, share responsibilities. Children belong to everyone, everyone belongs to the band. His description painted a picture that contrasted sharply with the isolation of frontier homesteading. The way settlers carved individual claims from communal land and defended them against all comers. Sarah thought of the long months she'd spent alone in the cabin while Thomas worked their claim, the way silence had become her primary companion. "Sounds less lonely," she said softly. "Loneliness can kill quick as cold," Kota replied, his attention on the baby in her arms. "People need people, especially mothers with small ones." The simple truth of it settled around them like the warmth radiating from the well-tended fire. Outside, the white world stretched endless and unforgiving, but inside the cabin, surrounded by the evidence of care freely given, Sarah began to imagine what it might feel like to belong somewhere again. By afternoon, the world had emerged from winter's white shroud into crystalline clarity that hurt the eyes with its beauty. Sunlight struck the snow-covered landscape and shattered into a million points of brilliance, transforming the territory from a place of death into something that resembled paradise, carved from ice and light. Sarah stood at the window. Emily, sleeping against her shoulder, while James dozed in Cod's competent arms. The view stretched for miles now that the storm had passed. rolling hills that sparkled like scattered diamonds, pine trees bent under, their burden of snow but not broken, the distant smudge of smoke that marked other homesteads scattered across, the vast expanse. Beautiful, she murmured, and meant it despite everything. Dangerous beautiful, Coda replied from where he sat by the fire. Easy to get lost in all that white. Easy to think you know where you're going. His words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, and Sarah found herself considering the metaphor as she watched the pristine landscape. She thought she knew where she was going when she'd left Pennsylvania with Thomas, toward prosperity, toward a life carved from determination and hard work. But standing here in a cabin, warmed by a stranger's kindness, holding a child fed by another culture's wisdom, she wondered if she'd ever known her destination at all. A sound from outside drew her attention, the distant jingle of harness bells and the creak of wagon wheels struggling through snow. Her heart performed in complicated rhythm as she strained to see the source of the noise. Could it be Thomas finally returned? Or perhaps neighbors checking on isolated homesteads after the storm? Coda was already moving, setting James carefully in his crate before rising to check the window. His body language shifted subtly, not alarm exactly, but the alert attention of someone who understood that travelers in winter didn't always bring good news. 2 men, he said quietly. Wagon team coming up the valley from town direction. Sarah pressed closer to the glass, trying to make out details through the glare of sunlight on snow. The approaching wagon moved slowly but deliberately. Its occupants, bundled against the cold, but managing their team with the confidence of experienced winter travelers. Thomas, she whispered, though something in her chest already knew it wasn't him. Different build, older men. Coda's voice carried careful neutrality, but Sarah caught the undertone of caution. Best I move away from the window. Some folks get ideas about Comanche, don't matter the circumstances. The reminder hit Sarah like cold water. In her gratitude for Coda's help, she'd somehow forgotten the larger world's prejudices, the way fear and ignorance could transform a rescue into something darker. She'd heard the stories, wild tales of savagery and violence that painted all native peoples with the same blood-soaked brush. "No," she said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "You saved our lives. I won't hide that from anyone." Coda paused in his movement toward the back of the cabin, something like respect flickering in his storm-colored eyes. "Might make things complicated for you. Some folks don't understand winter necessity." "Then they can learn," Sarah adjusted, Emily against her shoulder, drawing strength from the weight of her child and the memory of Coda's hands extending help without hesitation. "For you're welcome in this house. Anyone who doesn't like it can leave." The wagon was close enough now to make out individual figures, 2 middle-aged men in heavy coats, one driving while the other scanned the landscape with the systematic attention of someone searching for something specific. They weren't strangers to this country. That much was clear from the way they handled their team and navigated the treacherous snow-covered ground. "Marshal Jensen," Coda said quietly, recognition in his tone. "From the trading post. Know him by sight?" Sarah felt a flutter of something between relief and anxiety. Jensen had traded with Thomas several times, had seemed like a decent man in their brief interactions, but she'd heard him tell stories about Indian raids, had listened to him, dismissed the Comanche as threats to civilized settlement. What would he make of finding her alive because of Cod's intervention? The wagon pulled up to the cabin with a final jingle of harness. Sarah heard voices, Jensen's familiar tone, and another she didn't recognize, discussing the signs of habitation. The smoke from the chimney, the evidence that someone had been working outside despite the recent storm. A knock came at the door, firm but respectful. Sarah looked toward Coda, who had positioned himself where he could be seen, but not appear threatening. He nodded once, a gesture that seemed to say whatever happened next, they would face it together. Sarah opened the door to Marshal Jensen's weathered face, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance, the baby in her arms, the warmth and comfort of the cabin behind her, the clear evidence that she'd not only survived the storm but thrived during it. "Mrs. Mitchell, thank God you're safe." Jensen's relief seemed genuine, though his gaze moved past her to catalogue the interior of the cabin. "When Thomas didn't make it back to town, we feared the worst. Been searching since the storm cleared. Thomas." Sarah's voice caught on her husband's name. "He made it to town. Made it as far as the trading post before the worst hit. Been snowed in there 3 days now." Jensen's attention had found Coda, and Sarah watched recognition and weariness flicker across his features. "Been worried sick about you out here alone." "I wasn't alone," Sarah said clearly, shifting Emily so Jensen could see how well Kara read. "For the baby appeared. Coda Reynolds saved our lives. Without his help we wouldn't have survived." The words hung in the crisp air between them, a bridge of truth spanning the gap between prejudice and reality. Jensen's companion, a younger man Sarah didn't recognize, moved closer to hear better, his own eyes taking in the scene with the careful attention of someone forming judgments. That. So Jensen's tone had gone carefully neutral, the voice of a man navigating unexpected territory. His eyes moved between Sarah and Coda, calculating implications and possibilities. "It is," Sarah said firmly. "Mr. Reynolds brought food and firewood when we were nearly out of both. He kept us warm and fed while we waited for the storm to pass." She watched Jensen process this information, saw him struggle between his preconceptions and the evidence of his own eyes. Here was a woman clearly thriving rather than traumatized, babies who looked healthy and well cared for, a cabin that radiated warmth and safety rather than the aftermath of crisis. "Well," Jensen said finally, tipping his hat toward Coda with grudging courtesy. "Guess we owe you thanks, Reynolds. Not many would venture out in weather like that to help strangers." Coda nodded acknowledgement, but said nothing, his presence steady and unassuming. Sarah felt a surge of pride in his dignity, in the way he neither defended himself nor demanded recognition, but simply stood as living proof that goodness could cross any boundary drawn by fear. The cabin felt smaller with 4 adults inside, though Jensen and his companion, introduced as Pete Morrison from a neighboring homestead, had accepted coffee and settled themselves by the fire with the careful politeness of men navigating unfamiliar social territory. Sarah served them from Cod's seemingly endless provisions, noting how they watched him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Thomas is beside himself with worry," Jensen was saying, cradling his tin cup between work-roughened hands. "Soon as the road's clear enough for safe travel. He'll be heading back probably tomorrow, day after at the latest." The news should have filled Sarah with joy, but instead she felt something more complicated settle in her chest. Thomas's return would mean explanations, decisions, a reckoning with choices she wasn't sure she was ready to make. She glanced toward Coda, who sat slightly apart from the group, his attention seemingly focused on James sleeping peacefully in his arms. "Road's going to be treacherous for a while," Morrison observed, following Sarah's gaze toward Coda with unconcealed interest. "Lucky you had help during the worst of it." "More than lucky," Sarah said firmly. "Without Mr. Reynolds, my children and I would have died." The blunt statement hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison shifted uncomfortably while Jensen studied the contents of his coffee cup with sudden intensity. These were practical men who understood winter's dangers, but accepting help from a Comanche required adjustments to their world view that didn't come easily. Your people, Jensen, said finally addressing Kota directly. They winter nearby. Willow Creek area. Kota replied with characteristic economy. Been hunting in this territory. Saw the smoke getting thin. Came to check. Hunting's good this year? The question carried undertones Sarah didn't fully understand. Territory marking perhaps our assessment of competition for resources. Good enough. Take what's needed. Leave the rest. Kota's response held quiet dignity that somehow made the conversation feel less like interrogation and more like negotiation between equals. Jensen nodded slowly, and Sarah caught something that might have been respect in his expression. Smart approach. Land's got enough for everyone if folks don't get greedy. Emily stirred against Sarah's shoulder, making small sounds of hunger that provided welcome distraction from the undercurrents of tension in the room. As she adjusted her daughter for nursing, she became aware of the careful way the men avoided watching, the polite fiction that allowed her to tend her child without impropriety. Mrs. Mitchell, Morrison said during the brief lull, your husband asked us to bring you back to town if we found you well enough to travel. Trading Post's got good rooms upstairs, warm and safe. Might be more comfortable than staying out here while the weather settles. The suggestion sent an unexpected pang through Sarah's chest. Town meant safety, civilization, the return to patterns she understood. But it also meant leaving this strange sanctuary, where she'd discovered strength she hadn't known she possessed, where her children had thrived under the care of someone who saw them simply as small humans deserving protection. That's kind, she said carefully, but I think we're better off here for now. The babies are settled and traveling in this weather seems risky. Jensen and Morrison exchanged glances that spoke of concern mixed with puzzlement. Women were supposed to want rescue, supposed to prefer the security of established settlements to the uncertainty of frontier isolation. Sarah's reluctance to embrace their offer clearly fell outside their expectations. Begging your pardon, ma'am, Jensen said gently, but it might not be proper staying out here with. He gestured vaguely toward Kota, the sentence trailing off into implications he couldn't quite voice. Heat rose in Sarah's cheeks, not embarrassment, but anger at the suggestion that accepting life-saving help somehow compromised her respectability. Mr. Reynolds has conducted himself with perfect propriety. He's shown nothing but kindness and a respect toward my family. Not saying otherwise, Jensen said quickly, raising placating hands. Just thinking about appearances, what folks might say. Frontier life's hard enough, without giving people reason to gossip. The words hit harder than Sarah expected, forcing her to confront realities she'd been avoiding. The Colorado Territory was still wild country, but it was also filling with settlers who brought their prejudices and social expectations along with their plows and building plans. A woman who accepted help from a Comanche who seemed comfortable in his presence would become the subject of speculation that could poison her family's future prospects. People will say what they want regardless, Kota spoke quietly. His first contribution to this line of conversation. Question is whether you let their words matter more than what's true. His observation cut through the social complexity with startling clarity. Sarah looked around the warm cabin, at her healthy children, at the evidence of care and competence that had preserved their lives when civilization structures had failed them. What did reputation matter against the reality of her family's survival? I appreciate your concern, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. But we'll stay here until Thomas returns. This is our home. The declaration felt more significant than a simple statement of preference. In choosing to remain, she was also choosing to trust her own judgment over social pressure, to value substance over appearance. The decision sent a flutter of something that might have been freedom through her chest. Morrison looked as if he wanted to argue further, but Jensen placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Your choice, of course. But if you change your mind, or if anything happens you need help with, you send word, we'll come running." The offer was genuine, Sarah could tell, motivated by real concern rather than social obligation. These were good men struggling to navigate a situation their experience hadn't prepared them for. She felt a sudden warmth toward them, despite their limitations. "Thank you. That means more than I can say." As the men prepared to leave, bundling themselves back into their heavy coats and preparing to face the journey back to town, Sarah felt the weight of choices settling around her like snow. Thomas would return soon, and with him would come decisions she couldn't postpone indefinitely. But for now, in the warm sanctuary of her cabin, surrounded by the evidence of unexpected grace, she was content to let tomorrow take care of itself. After Jensen and Morrison's departure, the cabin felt larger somehow, as if their questions and concerns had taken up more space than their physical presence. Sarah moved through evening tasks with unusual awareness of every gesture, every interaction between herself and Coda, now viewed through the lens of how it might appear to critical eyes. The baby seemed oblivious to the afternoon's tension, responding to the unchanging rhythm of care and attention that had become their new normal. Emily nursed contentedly, while James dozed in his makeshift cradle, both children displaying the robust health that spoke of needs consistently met. Coda had returned to his quiet tasks, banking the fire for the night, checking the security of windows and doors, organizing his pack with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to being ready for quick departure. His movements carried a subtle change, a slight withdrawal that suggested he'd heard more in the afternoon's conversation than the visitors had intended to convey. "You're thinking of leaving," Sarah said, the observation emerging before she. "It could weigh its wisdom." He paused in his work, hands stilling on the leather ties of his pack. "Might be best. Your husband returns. Won't need extra complications." The practical reasoning was sound, Sarah knew, but it stirred something rebellious in her chest. "You're not a complication. You're the reason my children are alive. Same thing sometimes in folks' minds." Coda's tone held no bitterness, only the weary acceptance of someone who navigated prejudice often enough to predict its patterns. Town people see Comanche, think trouble, don't matter what actually happened. Sarah found herself moving closer. Emily, still cradled against her shoulder. "Oh, you can't let their ignorance drive your decisions. Can't let it drive yours either." He met her eyes with the direct gaze that had become familiar over their days together. "They're right about one thing. Reputation matters out here. Your family needs to be accepted, trusted. Can't happen if people think you've been compromised." The word hung between them, loaded with implications that made Sarah's cheeks warm. She understood the ugly logic behind it. A woman alone with a man not her husband, especially a man from a culture many settlers viewed as savage, would become the subject of speculation that could follow her family for years. "Then they need better education," she said firmly. "They need to learn that Comanche people are human beings, capable of kindness and honor." Codd's expression softened slightly, something that might have been admiration flickering in his eyes. "Noble thought. But you got children to protect. Can't change the world if the world won't let you belong to it." The observation stung because it carried truth she didn't want to acknowledge. The Colorado Territory was growing, becoming more settled, and therefore more rigid in its social expectations. A woman who flagrantly defied those expectations wouldn't just damage her own prospects. She'd harm her children's chances for acceptance, education, opportunity. "What would you do?" she asked quietly. "In my place?" He considered the question with characteristic care. "Depends what matters most. Safety looks different to different people. That's not an answer, because it's not my choice to make." His tone gentled. You got to decide what kind of life you want for them little ones. What kind of world you want to live in. Sarah looked down at Emily, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then across to James in his cradle, and felt the weight of their future pressing against her heart. Everything she chose from this moment forward would shape their possibilities, their understanding of right and wrong, their capacity to see beyond the boundaries others drew around difference. My mother used to say, "Courage isn't the absence of fear." She found herself saying it's acting right despite being afraid. Wise woman. Coda's smile carried warmth that seemed to light the room from within. What would she think about this situation? Sarah considered the question, calling up memories of her mother's voice, her patient way of examining problems from multiple angles before settling on courses of action. She'd ask whether I was making choices from love or fear. And which is it? The question cut straight to the heart of her dilemma. Fear would send her to town, would have her follow the safe path of social acceptance and conventional respectability. Love for her children, for the truth of their survival, for the man who'd risked winter's dangers to help strangers, pointed towards something more difficult, but ultimately more honest. Love, she said quietly. The word feeling like a commitment, spoken aloud. Coda nodded as if her answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then you'll figure out the right path. Love usually does. Outside, full darkness had settled over the white world, but inside the cabin, lamplight created a warm circle that felt separate from the harsh territory beyond their walls. Sarah moved to the window and looked out at the star-scattered sky, seeing in its vast clarity a reflection of possibilities that stretched beyond her current understanding. Tomorrow would bring Thomas's return, along with explanations and decisions she couldn't postpone indefinitely. But tonight, in the space between the world she'd known and the one she was still discovering, she allowed herself to rest in the simple peace of a choice made from the heart rather than fear. Dawn brought the sound of horse hooves crunching through snow and the jingle of harness that announced Thomas's long-awaited return. Sarah stood at the window, watching her husband's approach, noting the way relief and determination mixed in his posture as he guided his horse toward the cabin. That still stood intact despite winter's assault. Behind her, Coda moved with quiet efficiency, gathering his belongings and preparing for departure. They discussed this moment during the restless hours of early morning, agreeing that Thomas deserved to find his family without complications. That would require immediate explanation. "You don't have to leave," Sarah had whispered while the babies slept. "This is as much your home now as ours. Your husband needs to see his family whole and safe," Cod had replied with characteristic wisdom. "Everything else can come after." Now watching Thomas dismount and secure his horse, Sarah felt the approaching end of the strange interlude that had transformed her understanding of survival, community, and the arbitrary nature of the boundaries. People drew around belonging. Her throat tightened with emotions she couldn't fully name. The door opened before Thomas could knock, and Sarah found herself in her husband's embrace, breathing in the familiar sense of leather and tobacco that had once meant home and safety. Thomas held her tightly, his relief palpable as he murmured grateful prayers against her hair. Thank God you're all right," he whispered, his voice rough with exhaustion and worry. "When the storm hit and I couldn't get back, I thought—" "We're fine," Sarah assured him, stepping back so he could see the evidence for himself. "All of us. The babies are healthy and growing." Thomas's attention moved to Emily sleeping peacefully in her makeshift cradle, then to James, who chose that moment to wake and add his voice to the reunion. The sight of his children thriving despite the crisis that had kept him away brought tears to Thomas's eyes. "How?" he asked, lifting James with the careful reverence of a father reacquainting himself with precious cargo. "The supplies were—" So low when I left, and that storm. We had help, Sarah said simply, then turned to where Cota stood near the back door, pack ready for departure. Thomas, this is Coda Reynolds. He saved our lives. Thomas's attention moved to Coda with surprise, that quickly shifted to assessment. Sarah watched her husband take in the evidence of their survival, the well-stocked pantry, the expertly maintained fire, the obvious health of his family, and see it juxtaposed against his own preconceptions about who might provide such aid. Mr. Reynolds, Thomas said carefully, the name unfamiliar on his tongue. My wife says you helped during the storm. Storm was bad. Your family needed assistance. Cota's response carried no expectation of gratitude or recognition, simply the statement of facts as he saw them. More than assistance, Sarah interjected, unwilling to let Cod's modesty minimize what he'd done. He brought food when we were nearly out, wood when our fire was dying. Without his help, your children wouldn't have survived. The blunt statement hit Thomas like a physical blow. Sarah watched him struggle with the reality that his family's survival had depended on the kindness of a stranger. And not just any stranger, but a man whose very presence in their home would raise questions about propriety and judgment. I'm in your debt, Thomas said finally, extending his hand toward Coda with visible effort, more than I can ever repay. Coda accepted the handshake, with quiet dignity. No debt, just neighbors helping neighbors. Nevertheless, Thomas's voice carried the formal tone he used when discussing business arrangements. If there's anything I can do, any way to show my gratitude, nothing needed. Coda shouldered his pack, preparing for departure. Your family safe. That's enough. Sarah felt panic rise in her chest as she watched Coda move toward the door. After days of his steady presence, his practical wisdom and quiet strength, the thought of returning to isolation felt like stepping backward into a smaller version of herself. Where will you go? She asked, the question carrying more weight than its simple words suggested. Back to my people. Winter camp still good for another month or two. Coda paused at the threshold, his eyes meeting hers with understanding that seemed to bridge all the words they couldn't speak. Take care of those babies. They're lucky to have you. The simple blessing carried layers of meaning that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. In those few words lay recognition of her strength, acknowledgement of her capability, and faith in her ability to choose her family's path forward. Thank you, she whispered, the words inadequate for everything she wanted to express. Coda nodded. Once then stepped out into the brilliant morning sunlight that turned the snow-covered world into a canvas of possibilities. Sarah watched him walk away with the confident stride of someone who belonged to the land itself, carrying with him the knowledge that their brief intersection had changed something fundamental in the patterns of her life. Thomas closed the door behind Cod's departure, then turned to face his wife with questions written clearly in his expression. Sarah, what exactly happened here while I was gone? The moment of reckoning had arrived. Sarah looked at her husband, seeing in his face the mixture of gratitude and confusion that would characterize all their future conversations about these days. How could she explain that in helping them survive, Coda had also helped her discover strengths she hadn't known she possessed? How could she convey that his presence had shown her possibilities for human connection that transcended the boundaries society insisted on maintaining? We survived, she said simply, and we learned that survival sometimes comes from unexpected places. Thomas nodded slowly, but Sarah could see him filing away questions for later examination. Outside, the white world stretched endless and clean, holding within its pristine surface the tracks of a man walking away from one story and toward whatever the next chapter might bring. The days following Thomas's return took on a rhythm of careful normalcy that felt both familiar and strange. Sarah went through the motions of her established routine, cooking, cleaning, tending the babies, while Thomas worked to repair storm damage and restock their depleted supplies. They spoke of practical matters with the ease of long partnership, but beneath their conversations lay currents of tension neither was ready to acknowledge. Thomas had accepted the story of their survival with the gratitude appropriate to a man whose family had been saved by another's intervention, but Sarah caught him watching her sometimes, with puzzled attention, as if she'd become someone he didn't quite recognize. The changes in her were subtle but unmistakable. A new confidence in her movements, a steadiness in her voice when discussing plans and possibilities, a way of looking toward the horizon that suggested expanded awareness of what lay beyond their small homestead. The babies thrived in their father's presence, responding to his gentle attention with the adaptability of infants who accepted love from any willing source. But Sarah noticed that Emily still settled most easily in her arms, and James seemed to sleep most peacefully when wrapped in one of the blankets Coda had left behind, soft wool woven with patterns that spoke of traditions far older than their own tentative claims on this territory. On the fourth evening after Thomas's return, as they sat by the fire with Emily nursing quietly and James sleeping in his cradle, her husband finally voiced the questions that had been gathering weight between them. "The man who helped you," Thomas said carefully, his attention focused on whittling a toy horse from a piece of pine. "Reynolds, how long was he here?" 3 days, Sarah replied, keeping her voice level despite the quickening of her pulse. "From when the storm was worst until you came back." 3 days, Thomas tested the words as if measuring their significance. Long time to be snowed in with strangers. The observation carried implications that made Sarah's cheeks warm with something between embarrassment and anger. "Long enough for him to save our lives while you were safe in town." The sharp edge in her voice surprised them both. Thomas looked up from his carving, startled by her tone, while Sarah felt a flutter of panic at her own boldness. She'd never spoken to her husband with such directness, had never challenged his decisions or priorities so openly. "Sarah, I didn't mean." Thomas set down his knife, reaching toward her with conciliatory gestures. "I'm grateful, more grateful than I can express. It's just that people have been talking in town, asking questions about what happened out here." "What kind of questions?" The words emerged sharper than Sarah intended, but she found herself unwilling to soften them. About propriety, about appearances. Thomas's discomfort was evident in the way he avoided her eyes. Jensen and Morrison spread the story around, thinking they were being helpful, but some folks are wondering whether it was appropriate for you to accept help. From a Comanche man, the ugly word hung between them like smoke from a dirty fire. Sarah felt Emily tense against her breast, responding to the sudden rigidity in her mother's body. She forced herself to breathe slowly to maintain the calm that kept her daughter peaceful. "Appropriate," she repeated, tasting the word's bitter edge. "What would have been appropriate, Thomas? Letting your children freeze to death rather than accepting help from someone willing to give it?" "Of course not." Thomas's voice carried frustration mixed with something that might have been fear. "But you have to understand how it looks. A woman alone with an Indian man for 3 days. No witnesses, no chaperone, no witnesses except your children who were kept alive by his care." Sarah's composure cracked slightly, letting anger leak through the careful control she'd maintained. No chaperone except necessity and common decency. Thomas flinched at her tone, clearly unprepared for this version of his wife who spoke her mind without cushioning her words in gentle deference. "Sarah, please, I'm not questioning what happened. I'm trying to protect our family's reputation." "From what?" "From the truth." Sarah shifted Emily to her shoulder, using the movement to create distance between herself and her husband's troubled expression. From people who would rather see children die than acknowledge that goodness can come from unexpected sources, from gossip that could follow us for years, Thomas said quietly, from speculation that could affect our standing in the community, our children's future prospects. The practical concerns were valid, Sarah knew, but they felt small and cramped compared to the larger questions their situation raised. How could reputation matter more than reality? How could social acceptance be worth the cost of denying the truth about their survival? "And what would you have me do?" she asked. "Lie about what happened? Pretend we survived the storm through divine intervention rather than human kindness? Maybe we could say it differently. Say a neighbor helped someone from town. People don't need to know all the details." The suggestion hit Sarah like a slap. Thomas was asking her to erase Coda from their story, to replace his identity with something more palatable to social prejudice. The request felt like betrayal, not just of the man who'd saved them, but of her own integrity. No. The word came out harder than she'd intended, carrying a finality that surprised them both. "I won't lie about this, Thomas. I won't diminish what he did or pretend he was someone he wasn't. Sarah, he risked his life to help strangers. He asked for nothing in return, showed nothing but respect and kindness. I won't dishonor that to make small-minded people more comfortable." Thomas stared at her with something approaching shock, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman his wife had become during his absence. The silence stretched between them, filled with the crackling of the fire and Emily's soft breathing, and the weight of choices that would shape their family's future. Outside, snow began to fall again, not the cruel blizzard that had first brought crisis to their door, but gentle flakes that drifted past the windows, like possibilities settling toward earth. The conversation with Thomas left Sarah feeling hollowed out and strangely liberated, as if speaking her convictions aloud had burned away everything inessential and left only the core of who she was becoming. She moved through the following days with new awareness of the weight her words carried, the power that came with claiming her own voice in decisions that affected her family's future. Thomas, for his part, seemed to be reassessing the woman he'd married, watching her with the careful attention of someone discovering unexpected depths in familiar territory. Their interactions grew more formal, edged with the politeness of people negotiating new boundaries. They discussed practical matters, supplies needed, repairs planned, preparations for spring planting, but avoided the larger questions that hummed beneath every conversation. The babies remained blissfully unaware of their parents' tension, responding to care and attention without concern for the philosophical implications of their survival. But Sarah found herself studying their faces during quiet moments, wondering what kind of world she wanted them to inherit, what values she hoped to instill, in hearts still innocent of prejudice. A week after Thomas's return, as Sarah was hanging laundry in the weak afternoon sun, she spotted movement against the white landscape, a solitary figure on horseback, approaching from the direction of Willow Creek. Her heart performed a complicated rhythm as she recognized Coda's steady posture, and the way he sat his horse, as if they were two parts of a single entity. Thomas emerged from the barn where he'd been mending harness, his own attention drawn by the approaching rider. Sarah watched her husband's face carefully, noting the mixture of weariness and curiosity that flickered across his features as recognition dawned. "Reynolds is coming back," Thomas observed unnecessarily. "Yes," Sarah continued hanging sheets, using the mundane task to steady her racing pulse. "I wonder why." Coda dismounted near the cabin, securing his horse with efficient movements before approaching the house. He carried a bundle wrapped in soft leather, and something in his posture suggested purpose beyond a simple social visit. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, nodding respectfully toward Thomas. "Mrs. Mitchell, hope you don't mind the intrusion." "Of course not," Sarah replied before Thomas could speak. You're always welcome here." Thomas shot her a sharp look, but said nothing, maintaining the careful courtesy that had characterized his interactions with Coda. "Something we can help you with. Actually came to offer help?" Coda shifted the bundle in his arms, and Sarah caught a glimpse of intricate beadwork decorating the leather wrapping. "Been thinking about what you might need for the babies growing like they are." The observation brought warmth to Sarah's chest, evidence that Coda had continued to think about their welfare even after returning to his own life. "They are growing. Emily's already outgrown the first clothes I made for her." Thought, "You might need these." Coda unwrapped the bundle, revealing tiny garments worked with the skilled hands of someone who understood both beauty and practicality. Soft leather booties decorated with careful beadwork, small shirts that would expand with a child's growth, blankets woven with patterns that seemed to hold stories within their geometric designs. Sarah accepted the gifts with hands that trembled slightly, overwhelmed by the generosity and the skill evident in every stitch. "These are beautiful. Who made them?" "My mother and her sisters. When I told them about the babies, they wanted to contribute." Coda's voice carried warmth mixed with something that might have been pride. Said, "Babies bring blessing wherever they're born, deserve welcome from everyone." The philosophy behind the gifts struck Sarah more powerfully than their material value. Here was a different understanding of community, one that extended care and celebration across the boundaries of blood and culture. She found herself thinking of her own mother, wondering what she would have made of this expression of sisterhood across such vast differences. "Please thank them for us," Thomas said, his voice carefully controlled. "It's very generous. Actually wanted to invite you to thank them yourself." Coda's attention moved between Thomas and Sarah, gauging their reactions to his next words. Spring. Gathering coming up at the winter camp. Celebration for the babies born during the cold months. Blessing for the growing season ahead. Your children would be honored guests. The invitation hung in the crisp air like a bridge extended across a chasm Sarah hadn't fully realized existed. She felt the weight of choice settling around her again, the familiar pressure of decisions that would echo far beyond their immediate consequences. "That's very kind," Thomas said slowly, "but I'm not sure it would be appropriate." The tear word fell between them with the dull weight of old prejudices, and Sarah felt something inside her chest flare with defensive heat. She looked at her husband's carefully neutral expression, then at Coda's patient dignity, and understood that this moment would define not just their immediate response, but the kind of family they would become. "I think it sounds wonderful," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the distance between fence posts and carrying implications that reached much further. "When is it planned?" Coda's smile was small but genuine, acknowledgement of her courage in defying social expectations. 2 weeks hence, when the moon is full. Good time for new beginnings." "Sarah," Thomas said quietly, warning in his tone. "The children should know there are people who celebrated their birth," she replied, meeting her husband's eyes with steady resolve. "They should understand that kindness exists beyond the boundaries we draw around it." Thomas looked between his wife and Coda, seeing perhaps for the first time the full implications of the choice before them. They could retreat into the safe insularity of their own kind, preserving social acceptance at the cost of broader understanding, or they could step forward into uncertainty, teaching their children that human worth transcended artificial categories. 2 weeks, Thomas said finally, capitulation clear in his voice. "We'll consider it." Sarah felt victory and fear in equal measure, knowing that in accepting this invitation, and she would accept it despite Thomas's reservations, she was choosing a path that would change their family's story in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The 2 weeks following Cod's invitation passed with the tension of a held breath. Sarah found herself preparing for the spring gathering, with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that manifested in restless energy she channeled into practical tasks. She mended their best clothes, practiced carrying both babies efficiently, and tried to imagine what questions Emily and James might ask someday about this moment when their parents chose acceptance over fear. Thomas approached the coming event with the systematic resignation of a man fulfilling an obligation rather than embracing an opportunity. He sharpened his rifle, checked their supplies, and made careful inquiries in town about the Comanche camp. At Willow Creek, the information he gathered seemed to reassure him somewhat. Chief Standing Bear was known as a man of peace. The winter encampment had caused no trouble for local settlers, and several traders spoke of fair dealings with the band. But beneath his practical preparations, Sarah sensed her husband's continued discomfort with the social implications of their attendance. She caught him watching her with puzzled attention, as if trying to reconcile the woman who insisted on honoring Comanche hospitality with the quiet wife he'd thought he'd married. Jensen stopped by the trading post again yesterday. Thomas mentioned, during breakfast on the morning they were to depart, asked more questions about our plans. Sarah paused in feeding Emily, hearing the weight behind his seemingly casual observation. What kind of questions? Whether we were really planning to attend an Indian gathering, whether I thought it was wise given talk in town. Thomas avoided her eyes, focusing instead on adjusting James's blanket with unnecessary precision. He's concerned about our reputation. Mr. Jensen's concern is noted, Sarah replied, keeping her voice level despite the irritation prickling along her spine. But our family's decisions aren't subject to his approval. Sarah, please think about what this means for the children's future, the connections they'll need, the acceptance. I'm thinking about their future. Sarah's voice carried a firmness that surprised them both. I'm thinking about the kind of people I want them to become, whether they'll learn to see difference as threatening or as an opportunity for understanding. Thomas set down his coffee cup with careful control, and if our neighbors decide we're not the kind of people they want to associate with, if doors close because we've chosen to open others. The questions were valid, Sarah knew, rooted in practical concerns about survival, in a community that demanded conformity as the price of belonging. But they also represented a cramped vision of what their life could become, a willingness to limit their children's world to what others deemed acceptable. Then we'll build relationships with people whose doors remain open, she said quietly. We'll teach Emily and James that worth isn't determined by social acceptance, but by how we treat others when no one's watching. Thomas stared at her with something approaching admiration mixed with exasperation. When did you become so certain about everything? The question cut straight to the heart of her transformation. When had she stopped seeking permission for her convictions? When had she begun trusting her own judgment over the comfortable assumptions that had once guided her? Choices? When I realized that survival sometimes requires courage, she answered honestly. When I learned that the world is bigger than I'd allowed myself to imagine. They completed their preparations in relative silence, loading the wagon with gifts Cody had suggested they bring, blankets woven by Sarah during the long winter evenings, preserves made from berries gathered the previous autumn, small tokens that acknowledged the reciprocal nature of community celebration. As they prepared to leave, Sarah pinned her mother's cameo brooch to her dress with hands that trembled slightly. The familiar weight of the carved shell against her chest felt like a blessing carried forward from one generation to the next, a reminder that courage could be inherited along with jewelry and recipes, and the shapes of eyes that marked family resemblance. Thomas helped her into the wagon with careful courtesy, then lifted the babies with the gentle precision of a father who understood their precious fragility. Emily and James rode wrapped in blankets that combined Sarah's practical weaving with decorative patterns Coda's mother had added, visual evidence of the cultural bridge their family was choosing to cross. The journey to Willow Creek took them through country transformed by approaching spring. Snow still covered the ground in patches, but the afternoon sun had warmth in it that spoke of winter's retreat. Sarah felt her anxiety ease slightly as they traveled, replaced by curiosity about what they would find at the Comanche camp. "Whatever happens today," Thomas said as the first smoke from the encampment became visible against the pale sky, "we face it together." Sarah reached across the wagon seat to squeeze his hand, grateful for his commitment, even if she couldn't share his reservations. "Together," she agreed, feeling the weight of the word settle around them like a promise made to an uncertain future. Ahead, the Comanche camp spread along the creek in an arrangement that spoke of temporary settlement, designed for both comfort and quick departure if necessary. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children's voices carried on the wind, and Sarah could see people moving among the lodges with the easy rhythm of community going about its daily business. As their wagon approached, she felt the weight of watching. Issa knew that this moment marked a threshold from which there would be no retreat. Whatever happened next would become part of their family's story, woven into the memories Emily and James would carry forward into their own complicated futures. The Comanche camp revealed itself as something entirely different from Sarah's nervous imaginings. Instead of the primitive arrangement she'd half expected, she found a well-organized community that balanced practicality with beauty in ways that spoke of deep understanding of both land and human need. Lodge covers stretched tight and neat, decorated with paintings that told stories she couldn't read, but felt in her bones. Children played between the dwellings, with the universal energy of young life testing its boundaries, while adults moved through tasks with the efficient grace of people who belonged completely to their environment. Coda emerged from one of the larger lodges as their wagon approached, his face lighting with genuine pleasure at their arrival. Behind him came a woman Sarah recognized as his mother by the similar shape of their eyes and the dignified way she carried herself. Willow song the healer whose herbs had restored Sarah's strength during those crucial days. "Mrs. Mitchell, Mr. Mitchell," Coda said, approaching the wagon with hands extended to help with the babies. "You honor us with your presence." Thomas accepted, Coda's assistance with visible tension, but Sarah saw him relax slightly as he observed the orderly nature of the camp, the way their arrival was noted, but not treated as spectacle. Whatever stories he'd heard about Comanche wildness found no support in the peaceful scene before them. Willawong approached with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being watched and judged. She spoke to Coda in their shared language, words that flowed like water over stones, then turned to Sarah with a smile that transcended any barriers of communication. "She says the babies have grown strong," Coda translated, as his mother examined Emily and James with the practiced eye of someone who delivered many children. "She's pleased to see them thriving." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the simple recognition of her success as a mother. "Please tell her I'm grateful for the medicine she sent. It made all the difference." The translation brought a broader smile to Willawong's face, and she reached out to touch the cameo brooch at Sarah's throat with gentle curiosity. Sarah unpinned it without hesitation, offering it for closer examination. "Beautiful work, Coda," said as his mother traced the carved shell with careful fingers. "She asks if it carries family history." "My mother's and her mother's before that," Sarah replied, watching Willawong nod with the understanding of someone who valued the weight of inherited objects. "Brought from Pennsylvania when we came west." The exchange seemed to satisfy some test Sarah hadn't known she was taking, Willawong returned the brooch with careful reverence, then spoke again to Coda in their flowing language. "She invites you to join the women's circle for the blessing ceremony," Coda explained. "Great honor, usually only for band members." Sarah looked toward Thomas, seeking permission. She realized she no longer needed. Her husband nodded stiffly, clearly out of his depth, but committed to seeing their choice through to its conclusion. The women's circle gathered near the creek, where afternoon light filtered through budding cottonwood trees and cast dancing shadows on the water's surface. Sarah found herself seated between Willowsong and a younger woman who smiled shilly while bouncing a toddler on her lap. The language barrier disappeared in the universal communion of mothers sharing concerns about children's health, growth, and futures. Emily and James were passed from hand to hand with the casual ease of a community that considered all children worthy of attention and protection. Sarah watched her babies respond to the gentle touches and soft voices, seeing in their relaxed acceptance a wisdom she was still learning to trust. The ceremony itself proved less foreign than Sarah had anticipated. Blessings spoken over the children, herbs burned to carry prayers skyward, songs that needed no translation because they spoke the language of hope for the next generation. She found herself humming along with melodies that seemed to arise from the earth itself. As the afternoon progressed, barriers dissolved in ways Sarah hadn't expected. Thomas joined a group of men examining horses and discussing the merits of different breeding lines. His expertise with livestock, creating common ground that transcended cultural differences. Children played games that crossed linguistic boundaries, and Sarah began to understand how community could exist beyond the narrow definitions she'd always accepted. When the time came to leave, the wagon was loaded with gifts that spoke of genuine affection. More blankets for the babies, herbs for Sarah's continued health, and food for their journey home. Willawong pressed a small leather pouch into Sarah's hands, speaking earnestly to Coda as she did so. "Medicine for teething," he translated. "She says all babies need it, and white doctors don't always know the gentle ways." The gift brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Recognizing it as acceptance into a network of care that extended far beyond blood relationships, she tried to express her gratitude, but found words inadequate for the transformation she felt occurring in her understanding of what family could mean. As they prepared to depart, Chief Standing Bear approached their wagon with the formal bearing to have someone making an official pronouncement. He spoke briefly to Coda, who nodded with evident pleasure. "The chief extends permanent welcome," Coda explained. "Says your children will always have a place here whenever they need it. Says courage deserves to be honored." Thomas accepted the pronouncement with stiff courtesy, but Sarah felt its weight settle around her like a cloak of belonging. Whatever happened in their future, whatever challenges they faced in the settler community they called home, her children would know there was another place where they were welcomed without reservation. The journey back to their homestead passed in contemplative silence, each member of the family processing the day's experiences in their own way. As their cabin came into view, familiar and yet somehow different after their glimpse of alternative possibilities, Sarah felt the weight of choices settling around them, like snow preparing to melt with spring's arrival. Spring came early that year, arriving with sudden warmth that sent snowmelt cascading down hillsides and transformed the white world into something green and gold and full of possibility. Sarah worked in her garden with Emily strapped to her, Beck and James sleeping in a basket nearby, feeling the sun on her shoulders and the promise of growth in the soft earth between her fingers. The months following their visit to the Comanche camp had brought changes, both subtle and profound. Thomas had grown more comfortable with their expanded understanding of community, especially after several successful trading relationships developed between Standing Bear's band and local settlers. What had begun as Sarah's choice to honor help received had evolved into something that benefited both communities in ways neither had anticipated. The social consequences they'd feared had proven less severe than expected. Some neighbors maintained their distance, uncomfortable with the Mitchell family's willingness to associate with Comanche people, but others had followed their example and discovered that prejudice often dissolved in the face of actual acquaintance. Jensen himself had begun trading horses with Standing Bear, admitting grudgingly that Comanche breeding practices produced animals of exceptional quality. Sarah's relationship with Thomas had settled into new patterns that acknowledged the woman she'd become during those crucial winter days. He no longer questioned her judgment about social matters, having learned to trust instincts that had guided their family toward acceptance rather than isolation. Their conversations carried depths that hadn't existed before, rooted in mutual respect rather than assumed roles. The babies thrived in their expanded world, growing strong and curious under the care of parents who valued difference as enrichment rather than threat. Emily had taken her first steps toward Willow Song during a spring visit, while James showed early signs of the linguistic flexibility that came from hearing multiple languages spoken with equal value. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The woman who had once sought permission for her convictions now moved through her days with the quiet confidence of someone who trusted her own judgment. She wore her mother's cameo brooch with new understanding of what inheritance truly meant. Not just objects passed down through generations, but the courage to honor what was right, regardless of social pressure. On this particular afternoon, as she worked among plants that would feed her family through the coming year, Sarah reflected on the strange paths that had led them to this point. A winter storm that had threatened to destroy everything had instead become the catalyst for discoveries that enriched their lives in ways she couldn't have imagined. A familiar figure appeared on the horizon, and Sarah's heart lifted with recognition. As Kota rode toward their homestead, his visits had become regular occurrences, welcomed by all members of the family as opportunities to maintain connections that transcended conventional boundaries. "Good day for planting," he observed, dismounting near the garden where Sarah worked. "Perfect day," she agreed, wiping dirt from her hands before lifting Emily from her carrying basket. "The babies have been asking for you." It was true. Both children brightened whenever Coda appeared, responding to his gentle attention with the trust of small hearts that recognized authentic care. "Actually came to invite you to another gathering," Coda said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Standing Bear's daughter is marrying a young man from the Arkansas band. Big celebration planned. Lots of families coming together." Sarah felt excitement flutter in her chest at the prospect of another opportunity to witness Comanche community in action. These gatherings had become highlights of their social calendar, offering perspectives on human connection that enriched their understanding of what family could mean. "For when?" she asked, already mentally organizing the preparation such an event would require. 2 weeks hence, planning to last 3 days, maybe 4. Great opportunity for the babies to meet more of their extended family. The phrase stopped. Sarah, short, carrying implications that hadn't occurred to her before. Extended family. Coda's easy assumption that Emily and James belonged to a network of care that stretched beyond blood relationships spoke to a worldview that had gradually become her own. Thomas emerged from the barn where he'd been working, drawn by the sound of familiar voices. His greeting to Coda carried warmth that would have been impossible to imagine during their first meeting, evidence of how much all their perspectives had evolved. "Coda brings news of a wedding celebration," Sarah reported, watching Thomas's face for signs of the old weariness. "Sounds like a good time," Thomas replied, surprising her with his ready acceptance. "Been too long since we've had reason to celebrate something joyful." As they discussed details of the upcoming gathering, Sarah marveled at how completely their lives had been transformed by a single winter storm and the choices it had forced them to make. What had begun as simple survival had evolved into something far more precious, the understanding that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly, despite uncertainty. Looking across the garden toward the horizon, where fountains still wore caps of snow, Sarah felt gratitude for the unexpected paths that had led them to this moment. Emily babbled contentedly in her arms, while James explored the world from his basket, both children growing into a future shaped by their parents' decision to choose love over fear, inclusion over isolation. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the land they were learning to call home. But those shadows no longer seemed threatening. Instead, they spoke of depth and possibility, of stories yet to be written and connections yet to be discovered. In choosing to honor the help they'd received, the Mitchell family had found something more valuable than social acceptance. They'd found their place in the larger human story of communities built on mutual respect and care. As Coda prepared to leave, promising to return with more details about the wedding celebration, Sarah felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that came with each new opportunity to expand their understanding of what belonging could mean. The future stretched before them bright with promise, shaped by choices made in love rather than fear, rooted in the recognition that human worth transcended all artificial boundaries. The wind carried scents of growing things and distant possibilities, whispering promises of seasons yet to come and stories yet to unfold. In the warm circle of family, both chosen and born, Sarah felt complete in ways she hadn't known were possible, grateful for the winter storm that had taught them the true meaning of home.